Howdy folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are bound for the Old West, saluting June on the Range, which is a month-long BookTube event created by Michael K. Vaughan, celebrating Western fiction, which I'm afraid is a dying breed these days. So he and his co-hosts are trying to breathe some life back into the old mare, and being a lifelong Western fan myself, I thought I'd hitch my wagon up to the train and see if I could help her along a little bit myself. And so a couple of weeks ago, I did a book haul video where I happened to mention an old project that I had given myself, tracking the old TV series by Warner Brothers, Maverick, starring James Garner and Jack Kelly. And I thought what I could do was create a website that strung together the trail from who knows where that Maverick was always traveling, and pieced the stories together in a chronological order that was never intended by the TV show itself, and make it all work somehow. Like, people have done this with Star Trek and trying to patch the star dates together and all that and have them travel in a logical trail across the final frontier. I was trying to do that with the old Western frontier with Maverick and all those stories. And a viewer of mine mentioned in the comments on that video that he liked Maverick and was trying to find a Maverick book that he could read for June on the Range, but all he could find was an old children's book that was published by Whitman Publishing back in 1959. So a book written for kids. And I thought that sounded kind of interesting because I had bought that book myself back when I was working on that Maverick Trails project, and but had never read it. I didn't really think that it was going to be true to the series or the characters or anything, so I just kind of had it set aside. But it had a lot of great illustrations in it. So one of the things I like to talk about on my channel when I talk about a book is also to talk about the artwork that went along with it, if it does. And so I went back and I pulled it off my shelf and started reading it. Again, like I say, without high hopes that it was going to be very true to the characters in the series. But I was happily surprised. It actually followed the character pretty well. And in fact, it even touched on some backstory that was discussed in one episode only of the original series. And that was a flashback episode that had Bret and Bart returning after the Civil War to their family ranch in Texas. And of course, they run into some trouble there and are trying to drive a herd to, I think, Arizona in that story, running into all kinds of problems. And then there is a murder that happens. Someone is killed towards the end of that episode. And the Mavericks are getting framed for that. And there's only one man, one witness that saw it that could clear their names so they were looking for that guy, the tall man, he was called, to take him into the law and have him tell the story and clear their names. But he disappears. And so that set up the momentum then for the rest of the series, why the Mavericks were always wandering from town to town. They were looking for a man, and they split up to find him, and were getting into and out of trouble in all the rest of the episodes, looking for the tall man, which they never found, at least in none of the stories of the series. And then the writers forgot about that. They just completely forgot about the tall man. It didn't matter anymore. Except to Roy Huggins, who created the series. This is just a little side story here for a second. But Roy Huggins remembered the tall man and the one man that could clear the name for this murder. And he developed that one little Maverick backstory nugget into a new series called The Fugitive, which, again, if you remember, ever saw the series or maybe the Harrison Ford movie, there was one man who could clear his name of murder. And that's why the fugitive was not only running from the law, but traveling around from town to town all over the country, same as the Mavericks. Eventually, the Mavericks were it was just assumed, and this made a lot more sense, really, according to the Maverick lore. They were gamblers. They were just wandering gamblers, always looking for that next big poker game, and that's what kept them moving. They didn't want to settle down. But that story was forgotten in that one episode. They mentioned the Civil War, and because they apparently had been raised as as ranchers. And so this book here, Bret Maverick gets a letter from a rancher that had helped him out back in his teenage years before the Civil War. And he had worked for that rancher for about a year, again, like I say, before the Civil War, and learned a lot under this guy's mentorship and tutelage, and how to get through rough times, how to survive. And Bret Maverick credits that rancher for kind of saving his life during the Civil War, because he knew how to avoid certain things. Now, most Maverick lore would say it was his old pappy, Maverick's old pappy, who always told him how to stay out of trouble and avoid conflict and all that, and always think your way out of trouble and outsmart your opponents and get away with things that way. But there was that little one episode that talked about the Civil War, and this kind of took advantage of that backstory. And so now, after the Civil War, Maverick is traveling across the West, and he gets a letter from that rancher telling him that he's got trouble and that someone's out to kill him and take over his ranch, and they've been rustling his herd and all that. So Maverick owes a lot to this guy, so he goes back to it's in eastern Arizona to help him, only to find out that he's already been murdered. He'd gotten ambushed, and his body just left in a river somewhere and was found later on. And now there's only his young daughter and younger son running the ranch, and they don't really know how to do that. And they are still getting rustled, and the bank is going to foreclose on the ranch. So it's a classic Save the Ranch Western story, really. But like I say, it actually pays tribute to the real character of Maverick in this book, in that there are robberies and a murder. The rancher is murdered in this, and Maverick, he's not a detective, but he uses his cunning and his insight in measuring up all of those people he would play poker with, looking for tells and looking for the human psychology and how to outsmart them and outtalk them and get them to reveal things and that kind of a thing. So it plays kind of a Sherlock Holmes character in this story, while still being true to the Maverick character. And I found that compelling. Even though the story was fairly well predictable, it moved right along at a good clip. It was written for kids, and so it held my attention. And it had his sense of humor. And so I kind of recommend this book. If you have any way of finding it, you'd probably have to haunt eBay in order to get a copy of it or something. But I quite enjoyed it. And it had all kinds of great illustrations. So let's talk a little bit about the writer and the artist for this book, and then we'll mosey along from there. Whitman Publishing's Maverick was written in 1959 by Charles Ira Coombs. He was born in 1914 in Los Angeles, and one of his first jobs was as a farmhand during the Depression. He moved on to the merchandising department for Sears and Roebuck after that, where he may have begun writing quite a bit. And then after that, he became a methods analyst for Douglas Aircraft during World War II. And he was known as a writer for the juvenile market. He wrote quite a bit of fiction, but also a lot of nonfiction for kids, and a lot of that was about airplanes and aircraft and aviation. So he had some expertise in that. He also wrote a lot of adventure comic strips back in the day. And if you're wondering why you're looking at a comic strip art here, it's because I tried to find a portrait of Charles Ira Coombs online and could find nothing. However, it turns out that in 1941, John Coleman Burroughs was creating a comic strip based on his father's John Carter of Mars series. Edgar Rice Burroughs was his father. And so he started creating this comic strip in 1941 and used Charles Ira Coombs as the life model for John Carter of Mars. So this could very well be the closest representation we have of what Charles Ira Coombs looked like. There he is. So he's in pretty good shape for a World War II aviation expert. Now, I have not been familiar with Charles Ira Coombs. I don't think that I've read anything else by him before, but if he cut his teeth writing adventure for comic strips, that probably explains why Maverick was so enjoyable to read. He captured the characters really well, like I said. The other characters in the story, aside from Maverick, that he had invented just for this book, they were not anything standout characters. They were very likable, or as far as the villains go, hateable. But he got the character of Maverick just right. One thing that he left out of the Maverick lore, I think, here is kind of a big one, but I can understand it since it was written for the children's market. And that was there was no poker in it, no gambling mentioned whatsoever. It was all cowboys and bad guys, and that was fine. There was plenty of shooting. There was a murder, but no gambling. Can't have any of that. The other thing that Charles Ira Coombs was maybe a little remiss in was his history. And it probably didn't matter for this particular market at that particular time, but it's telling the backstory of a rancher with this huge spread in eastern Arizona back in the years before the Civil War. And that just was no such thing back then. There were ranches in Arizona before that, going clear back to the 1600s, but they were all Indian or Spanish ranchers or Mexican ranchers that were raising cattle, and nothing to the degree that we think of as old Western ranches after the Civil War. Nothing like that. The earliest American, if you can call it that, American permanent ranch in Arizona was not until 1872, many years after the Civil War. So there's a little historic error there in this story. But like I said, it probably doesn't matter at all, because as kids, if you like Maverick and Westerns of those days, you didn't know any of the history before the Civil War or anything. You knew about the Civil War, and you knew about cowboys. And anything before or after that didn't really matter as far as telling a story. So there's that. Now, let's move on to the artwork here, and we'll start off by looking at the cover for Whitman's Maverick. And I really like this cover. It's a wraparound cover. The illustrations for Maverick here were credited to Alex Toth, but I don't think that he illustrated the cover. He definitely did the illustrations throughout the book, and there are a lot of them, and we'll look at a few of them here in a minute. But looking at this cover here does not look like Toth's style. So I don't know who was the artist on this cover, but it's still pretty good. It's got that wraparound style that we used to see quite a bit of, and the likeness of James Garner as Bret Maverick on the cover is pretty good. We see him striding at us here. There's a little note there, starring James Garner and Jack Kelly. Now, Jack Kelly played brother Bart Maverick, who's mentioned a couple times in the book, and I was glad to see that, because remembering back, a lot of times when people talked about Maverick, they just talked about Bret Maverick, the James Garner character. Jack Kelly often did not get, or Bart Maverick did not get enough credit, I think, as one of the Maverick brothers. And in fact, this book came out a couple of years after James Garner left the series, so he wasn't even a Maverick at the time this book came out. It was all Jack Kelly at that time. Roger Moore was Cousin Bo, and then there were a couple episodes with Robert Colbert as Brent Maverick for 2 episodes. That didn't work out so well. But James Garner is Maverick when people think of Maverick back in the day. So he's the one that the book is about, the character in the story. The rest of it, we just see a typical Western town, has very little to do with anything on the inside. They could have written any Maverick story for this book, and this cover would have worked just as well. But let's move on to the interior illustrations by Alex Toth, who you may not be familiar with the name, but if you were a fan of any of the old Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning superhero cartoon shows, you're familiar with his work. And so let's step inside the book now and take a look at some of his illustrations for Maverick. Alex Toth created a lot of illustrations for this book, but we're just going to take a look at 5 or 6 of them here to kind of walk through the story, and then also to familiarize you, if you're not already, with Toth's style. And for this book, he created all of these drawings as kind of 2-color sketches. He did some really tight black and white artwork that then could be separated from the background, which the printer then would print in a spot color, either an orange or a green, depending on the page that it landed on. And at the beginning of the story here, we see Bret Maverick sitting his horse, his roan horse, looking out over a valley across the desert of eastern Arizona to the Rio Conchos, which is a river that is actually in Mexico. It's a tributary of the Rio Grande, nowhere near eastern Arizona. But like I mentioned about the writer, Coombs got a few of his historic points wrong. He also got some geographic points wrong, but it's okay. We just know that Bret Maverick here is looking at the Rio Conchos as a landmark to know that he is getting close to the ranch of his old friend who sent him that letter, kind of a distress letter saying he's in trouble. And so Bret is going back to the ranch to help him out, not knowing that even at this point of the story, he's already been murdered, and Maverick himself is riding into a lot of trouble himself. Then the image with the green background on the next page there, that's a chapter page topper that is used at the beginning of every chapter throughout the book. Just sometimes it has a green background, sometimes it's orange, alternating back and forth throughout the book, showing Maverick walking his horse into town. Now, that's a generic enough image to use throughout the book, but in many times when Maverick is walking into town, he's usually carrying with him, either on his horse or in a wagon, several bad guys. He's always going out and bringing in more bad guys into the sheriff's office. But that's probably too specific chapter by chapter. So this is a nice, simple, generic image that can be used for any chapter. In the very next illustration, Bret is already in trouble. That's him standing in the center there with his hands up during a stagecoach robbery. Now, it's even worse than it looks like, because Maverick had come across this guy on the trail, just off the trail, with a buckboard, and the wheel has come off the buckboard, and so Maverick rides up and asks if he needs any help. Just as the Tucson stage comes rolling up there, and then the guy that we see there with the guns holding everybody up with the mask over his face there in the foreground, that's the guy that had the buckboard, and it turns out that he was using that as a diversion to get the stage to stop so he could hold it up. And now, of course, everyone on the stagecoach sees Maverick, he's the one guy without a mask, thinks he's in on it with the bad guys. So we see a few of the characters that we get to know better in the story later on. In the background, we see 2 riders come running up. Those are a couple more banditos there that are helping the guy rob the stagecoach, and things just get worse from here. Not much later, Bret has found his way to the Rocking H Ranch. That's the ranch that his old friend owned, and there's no one left there now other than 4 ranch hands. Used to be 100 ranch hands. Now there's 4. And the ranch is being tended over by his dead friend's oldest daughter and youngest son. And they hire him now, remembering who he was and now being convinced that he's a good guy. They hire him as their ranch foreman. And so Bret now has ridden out to find 2 of these guys at their camp out miles away, only to find out in a minute here that they're a couple bad guys. They're actually working for the rustlers, and Maverick has walked right into their hands. And so things are going to get bad again. Now, a few adventures later, Maverick is in the town of Red Bluff, which is near the Rocking H ranch, and he runs into Andy and Linda. That's the son and daughter of his old rancher pal. And they're talking about now going in to see the banker because the bank is going to foreclose on the ranch, and they've got to go and try to negotiate some things because they are going to foreclose on the ranch in just 6 days. So they've got just a very short amount of time to come up with the money that's been stolen off the stage in order to pay for the ranch, and they don't lose their inheritance there. So Bret is coming to the rescue once again, but things are about to get bad again. Maverick has been doing a lot of thinking, and he's put together a number of clues and tells that he's picked up from the people he's been dealing with, and he's starting to figure out kind of where this strong box with all the stolen money might be in. If he can recover that, then Andy and Linda can reclaim their ranch and pay off the cowboys and get out of all the trouble that they're in. But, of course, this leads Maverick and two of his trusted ranch hands into trouble in the caves and the lava beds in the vicinity there. And here we see them all tied up and waiting to make their move if they possibly can. And Maverick starts to double talk the guy who's looking after him and see if he can kind of figure their way out of this and get out of trouble before anything else goes wrong. And then finally, after many adventures that we skipped way over here, and I'm sure this is not a spoiler, but of course everything comes out in the end well for Maverick. And so we get to see Maverick shaking hands with the sheriff, who did not trust Maverick too well to begin with, but now they've been through a lot together and are parting good friends. And Maverick now is going to ride out of Red Bluff and go and meet up with Brother Bart in Texas for their next adventure, whatever that might be. Now, I really enjoyed the story, as I mentioned before, and the illustrations by Alex Toth here. He did a really good job in capturing Maverick, I think, in his drawings. They all look like Maverick, a little stylized, of course, but they feel as much like Maverick as Coombs' description and storytelling of Maverick. So again, a simple story, but well executed, especially for the kids market. And as a grown-up kid myself and a longtime Maverick fan, I completely enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun reading it. Now, let's before we hit the trail here, let's take a quick look at some of Alex Toth's other work that you might be more familiar with already. Alex Toth was born in 1928 in New York City, and like a lot of illustrators, he grew up loving to draw, and he wound up studying illustration at the School of Industrial Art in New York City. And he wanted to be a comic strip illustrator, and not the cartoonist type, but more the illustrative type, like Terry and the Pirates that he liked to read in the day, Flash Gordon and Prince Valiant, just the really, as realistic as possible, not cartoony style strips. But he felt that the comic strips were dying out. They were becoming old-fashioned and dying out. So instead, he started to focus more on comic books. So in 1947, he landed a job with DC Comics, no less, still back in the golden age, as an artist for Green Lantern. And he started out with the October-November 1947 issue number 28. And then just a couple issues later, the February-March 1948 issue number 30, his cover introduced Green Lantern's sidekick, Streak the Wonder Dog. Now, I don't know why all dogs in adventure comics back in the days were always wonder dogs, but I guess this started a tradition. In 1956, Toth moved from New York to Los Angeles and got a job with Dell Comics. Now, Dell was the distributor for Dell Comics, Whitman Publishing, and Gold Key Comics, all of which were known for their licensed material. They would do comic books and children's books based on works produced by a lot of the studios, a lot of Disney. And Toth himself started working on the Zorro comics, which were based on the serialization produced for the Mickey Mouse Club. And then some of the movies that were released by Disney. One of them was Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which was a great standalone early Sean Connery movie. And Toth did the illustrations for that comic book as well. It was during this time, 1959, he was still working for Dell, that he did the illustrations for the Maverick book that we've been talking about. His work at Dell led to an art director position with Cambria Productions in 1960, and they were producing a very limited animation cartoon series that was kind of experimental back in those days, that had fully illustrated frames and then just an arm or a leg might move, but they did this really eerie technique of filming the voice actors' lips mouthing the dialogue, and then they would take those live action lips and paste them onto the mouthless drawings of the characters. So you got this really strange effect watching them, but they were great stories and great artwork. And I'll leave a link down below to an episode that is on YouTube, so you can, if you've never seen it, you can see what I'm talking about as far as that bizarre effect. There was another kind of a partner cartoon series called Clutch Cargo, not illustrated by Alex Toth, but had that same inserted live action mouth there for the dialogue. Pretty creepy, but a lot of fun. Great adventure stories. Both of those were really good adventure stories. So if you're interested, check the link down below. And that brings us to the artwork that Alex Toth is probably best remembered for to this day, and you are likely familiar with them yourself once I show these to you, if you've ever been a science fiction or superhero fan of any kind. And that was when in 1966 he was tapped by Hanna-Barbera, who was starting to produce their own line of Saturday morning superhero cartoon series. And they brought in Alex Toth to design and create and art direct a number of series, including Space Ghost, the Herculoids, Birdman, Johnny Quest, the Fantastic Four, and probably the most well-known of all of them, Super Friends. And so he would do anything from designing the characters, creating the characters. He would, of course, art direct, and he would do storyboards and promotional artwork for all the different series, do the model sheets so that the animators could then have a standard style and types of looks and facial expressions and body postures and all of that, all created and laid down and blueprinted by Alex Toth. Now, Alex Toth was known to be kind of a cantankerous guy. He did not play well with others professionally. And Joe Barbera told a story once about how he got a 7-page letter from Toth, all neatly handwritten in that comic book style of lettering that we're all used to seeing. Very meticulous and with a certain artistic flair to it and all that. He'd painted an India ink black border around all the pages to set it off. But then he just launched into the Hanna-Barbera studios saying that everyone working on those projects, they're all idiots. They don't know what they're doing. And it was just all crap. And he took 7 pages to do that and actually delivered that letter artistically. And so Joe Barbera called him up after that. And Toth was surprised to hear from him. He told Barbera, he says, never thought that he would hear from him again. And Joe Barbera said, "Oh, the letter? I don't care about that. I have 3 pieces of artwork that I need for you." And Toth said, "Oh, when?" And Barbera says, "Thursday." And so Toth just dropped everything and got to work and delivered those 3 pieces of artwork in a couple of days. And I guess they sort of buried the hatchet after that. Apparently, there are a lot of similar stories from other people that had to work with or deal with Alex Toth through the rest of his career. But he worked for quite a while up until his death in 2006, and he actually literally died working at his drawing table. So hopefully that's how he wanted to go out. But there you have it. We took quite a bit of wandering from the trails of the Old West down through science fiction and superhero stuff with Alex Toth, but we covered a lot of history. It was a lot of fun to get more familiar with his artwork, with Maverick and some of those old Western tales. And so thanks for watching, and happy trails until we chat again. Thanks a lot.